Maastricht University in the Netherlands. First of all, I would like to welcome Mr. Nishigori, and he will defend his academic thesis, Why Do Doctors Work for Patients? Medical Professionalism in the Era of Neoliberalism. I would also like to welcome the two supervisors, Professor Dornan, Professor of Medical Education at Queen's University in Belfast, United Kingdom, and Dr. Boussari, Associate Professor of Medical Education, also at Maastricht University. I will introduce the opponents during the academic session, and I would like now to invite Mr. Nishigori to present a summary of your study and of your thesis. Please go ahead.
Can you see the presentation? Right. Okay, so hello, I'm Hiroshi Nishigori. Dear Prorector, dear members of the Corona, and dear all the audiences. I am now going to give a presentation on my PhD thesis entitled Why Do Doctors Work for Patients? Medical Professionalism in the Era of Neoliberalism. Work ethics in medical professionalism is the central theme of my doctoral dissertation. As a physician myself, I have been interested in this theme for the past 20 years. So today I'm very happy to make my presentation and have discussion on this theme. First, I will talk about the introduction. Earlier publications in medical education argued that programs to teach medical professionalism should acknowledge that it is socially situated. Medical educators need to take into consideration political and economic factors, cultural influences, rules and regulations, social upheavals, and other socio-cultural factors that influence medical professionalism when teaching and assessing it. Neoliberalism, the subtitle of this thesis, is a policy model seeking to transfer control of economic factors from the public to private sector. It's been gaining momentum worldwide since the beginning of the 21st century. The neoliberal movement has brought consumerist thinking into education, leading learners to ask teachers, is this worth learning, or is this worth doing? However, theoretically, learners cannot know what they will learn before they learn. So it is also difficult for medical students or residents to understand the meaning of what they learn or what they work before they complete their education or training. Previous authors have discussed the influence of market forces on medical professionalism, especially its negative ones. For example, Burks argued that altruism, one of the elements of medical professionalism, may be fundamentally incompatible with the culture of medicine and the current financial drive of healthcare. Therefore, I believe it is valuable to examine the influence of 21st century neoliberalism on medical education, especially medical professionalism. As already mentioned, there are other sociocultural factors besides neoliberalism that influence medical professionalism. It is well known that it's different in different cultures and languages. It is also influenced by work hour restrictions set by accreditation bodies. In times of catastrophe, work ethics can change, with some doctors naturally and voluntarily exhibiting medical professionalism by helping victims. This is true under the current influence of COVID-19. In my thesis, I describe these influences on medical professionalism. Here are the research questions of each study. For study 1, how has Japanese culture influenced the medical professions discussion? How does Bushido, a Japanese unique value system, influence medical professionalism? For study 2, what influences residents' subjective workload? For study 3, What motivates doctors to work for patients and above and beyond expectations? For study 4, how do Japanese doctors talk about yarigai, a sense of fulfillment from being engaged in an activity for its own sake, in caring for their patients? What kind of values are embodied in their stories about yarigai? In study 1, to gain insights into medical professions concepts in Japanese culture, I compared a frequently referenced Western guide to professionalism, the Physician Charter, with the concepts of Bushido, a Japanese code of personal conduct originating from the ancient samurai warriors. The 7 main virtues of Bushido are rectitude or gi, courage or yu, benevolence or jin, politeness or rei, honesty or sei, honor or meio, or loyalty or chuki. I also presented survey evidence about how a group of present-day Japanese doctors viewed the values of Bushido. Then I described similarities and differences between Bushido and the Physician Charter and speculated on factors that may account for the differences, including the influence of religion, how much group versus the individual is emphasized in a culture, and what emphasis is given to virtue-based versus duty-based ethics. The research question of study 2 is what influences resident subject workload. I recruited a convenient sample of 31 junior residents in 7 focus groups at the 3 community teaching hospitals. Through thematic analysis, I clarified 7 factors influencing resident subject workload, which are interaction within the professional community, feedback from patients, being in control, professional development, private life, interest, and protected free time. The research setting of the study 3 was the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami in Japan, which I thought could provide a unique opportunity for culture-situated research into doctors' intrinsic motivation to work for patients. The research question is, what motivates doctors to work for patients above and beyond expectations? Using qualitative inquiry, I conducted semi-structured individual interviews with 15 Japanese doctors who had joined disaster relief activities. Take-home message of this study is that doctors' intrinsic motivation is a two-edged sword. It both makes doctors put themselves out for patients and burns them out. Yarigai, a sense of fulfillment from being engaged in an activity for its own sake, was the concept I proposed in the study 4. Its research question was, how do Japanese doctors talk about yarigai in caring for their patients? Or what kind of values are embodied in their stories about yarigai? By adopting narrative inquiry as the methodology for this study, I interviewed 15 doctors who had demonstrated yarigai in caring for patients. In this study, I argued that yarigai stories of real-life doctors allow medical students to cultivate their own visions of the kind of doctor they aspire to become in the future, and enable them to find meaning in their occupation in their own way. I would like to start a discussion from do's other than Bushido. Do refers to one's path or way of life. When using the term do, especially in the context of teaching and learning, we refer not only to one's knowledge and skills, but also to one's attitude or behavior. Other do's include martial arts such as judo or aikido, the tea ceremony sado, and Japanese calligraphy shodo. Just a month ago, my colleagues and I conducted a faculty development collaborating with Shodo Master, and I believe there is room for further research on those in terms of medical professionalism. about the medical professions in non-Western cultures. In addition to Bushido paper, studies on the influence of culture on medical professions have been published. For example, China, South Korea, the Middle East, and Latin America. I hope research on cultural differences in medical professionalism will continue to advance internationally. Interestingly, my Bushido paper provoked a lot of discussion in the Journal of Medical Education in Japan after it was published. Nomura argued that Shonin-do, which is the do of merchants, is more appropriate because it is utilitarian and practical. Mukosho argued that the Analects of Confucius should be the Bible to follow when discussing medical professions in Oriental cultures. Ida, a cultural anthropologist, argued that it is essentialistic to refer to Bushido when discussing medical professions in Japan. She warned that Bushido professionalism enhances a stereotype of the Japanese having samurai-like qualities. As we already know, professions is a concept that has no single definition, so I think it is important to discuss it from such diverse perspectives. But for me personally, though, I'm drawn to the life of a samurai who lives for honor and not for profit, like a merchant. About the subjective workload, it is linked to the concepts of burnout and well-being. There have been an increasing number of academic papers analyzing burnout in doctors and physician well-being. So I hope that this study will contribute to the academic discussion related to these topics. Moving on to medical professions during a catastrophe, there are some previous literature on this topic, like the one of the February 2010 earthquake and tsunami in Chile. It was argued that this experience provided important lessons about the development of professionalism. In addition, it was also argued that it is necessary in such disaster situations to practice professionalism in order to maintain the basic function of the healthcare system. Based on his argument, what I describe in this thesis is heroism, not professionalism. Regarding to Yarigai, individual psychology founded by Alfred Adler recognized the value of the sense of contribution gained from helping others. In the context of medicine, doctors work for patients because they can feel a sense of contribution. I argue that this utilitarian approach is effective in teaching medical professionalism in the liberal political climate of the 21st century, and Yarigai is one of the key concepts. To answer the question, why do doctors work for patients? I argue that doctors do so because they want to gain a sense of contribution, or Yarigai. I have believed, and I will continue to believe, that working as a doctor is a privileged experience. This is because doctors can gain a sense of contribution, or Yarigai, by helping others, a feeling that money cannot buy, and one that cannot be imagined before we actually begin working as doctors. I believe this is what we should teach medical students and residents in the era of neoliberalism as medical professionalism. I would like to acknowledge the following people, especially the two supervisors, Professor Tim Donan and Dr. Jamiu Busari, and my wife Makiko and my son Sho. Without their support, I would never have been here. I would like to send my biggest thanks for them from the bottom of my heart. Finally, I'd like to tell you a little bit about this photo that I also used on the cover of my doctoral dissertation. Dense bamboo forests are common in Japan and other parts of East Asia. And we Japanese have lived with their beauty since ancient times. I believe that the Japanese culture behind my doctoral dissertation is based on the spirit of respecting such beauty. The path in the bamboo grove connects to the concept of do, or way of life, that I proposed in my doctoral thesis. In today's presentation, I mentioned do as a physician, and I myself would like to continue to pursue do as a physician as well as a researcher in medical education. This is the end of my presentation, and thank you very much for your kind attention. Now I give the word back to the prorector.
Thank you very much for your clear presentation. The opposition will be opened by Professor Diana Dolmans. She is Professor of Innovative Learning Arrangements at Maastricht University. Professor Dolmans.
Thank you, Mr. Prorector. Dear candidate, I have read your thesis with pleasure. You explored several topics such as values, working hour regulations, and also what drives doctors to help during disasters from a not typical Western but non-Western perspective. And I feel that your work is really very relevant. I enjoyed reading it. It was, easy to read. It was good to read. And so I would first of all like to congratulate you and also your team of supervisors with finishing your thesis. And, you already explained the beautiful cover of your thesis, but I also would like to say to you that I really felt it was a very nice and beautiful picture, which for me indeed indicated that you might have enjoyed and wondered this pleasant journey while working on your thesis. My questions, the first ones, relate to chapter number 3. In this chapter, you concluded that, being in control or, being able to craft your own job and having, of course, very supportive relationships with others at the workplace are important conditions for feeling well at work, for the well-being of people at the workplace. And these findings, that you report in your chapter number 3 also fit well with, findings that are reported in studies conducted in a Western context. So I really could, see the relevance of this study. But I'm also wondering a little, I also have a few questions about it, because you conducted this study in a Japanese setting in which, self-sacrifice, as you explained, is valued as positive, and in which there are yet, so far, no working hour restrictions in place. So, so it's a typical situation in which the data are collected. And let me come to my first question related to this chapter. I was wondering, let's assume that within the next few years, Japan might decide to implement working hour restrictions. I'm wondering, what do you think? Would this have a kind of positive or maybe negative effects when it comes to professional behavior of physicians or physicians taking care over patients? So I'm curious about your opinion.
Dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for asking an interesting question. Actually, we in Japan have a kind of work hour restriction in postgraduate training, which we didn't have especially when I was a resident. And what happened, especially in my institution, for example, is that doctors, residents, follow the work hour restrictions. So it's difficult, it's becoming more and more difficult for senior doctors to call junior doctors to come to hospital to work, especially for out of hours. So what happened if, to answer your question, what would happen, or what actually is happening right now, is that senior doctors or let's say attending doctors or supervisors have difficulty in dealing with work ethics, which is different. I mean that the supervisors' work ethics and the junior doctor's work ethics are different, and the supervisors are feeling difficult in dealing with that gap. Yes, so that may happen, and actually that is happening right now.
Did you also discover a little that this might make a difference when it comes to, working with patients, or, might it have advantages or disadvantages for both the care of the patient, but also the well-being of these residents? So tell me a little about, you felt maybe there were some positive findings and some negative.
Yeah, interesting. Just today, this afternoon, which is about, let's say, 6 hours ago, I had a talk with my students asking about their, or discussing their work ethic, work values, or work-life balance. And most of my students are answering that they like to have work-life balance. Yes, which is, I think, or I feel slightly, or maybe a big different from our generation's ones. So, yeah.
But let me help you a little.
Yes, please.
I have been supervising a master student who also has done some research in this area. And she also interviewed, not by the way in a Western context, she interviewed residents. And some said, well, given these work hour restrictions, I feel that, I'm also a little more relaxed, so I have more time to listen to the patient. So that might be an advantage. On the other hand, they also said, for example, in this study, well, given that now we have these regulations, I on occasions also feel a little guilty because I have to hand over the patient to someone else because my hours are over. So what are your ideas about, these advantages and disadvantages of working hour regulations?
Yeah, of course, I also I agree that there are advantages and disadvantages of introducing worker restrictions. Yes, which are already discussed and described in previous literature. For example, maybe we have, after introducing the worker restrictions, we have, or doctors have more work-life balance, more private time. But maybe we are losing continuity of care, or kind of losing a sense of contribution, which I described in my thesis. Or probably we are losing yarigai, maybe. Yes, that may happen.
And,
yes.
Given that it might have advantages and disadvantages, to regulate working hours.
Yes.
I'm also wondering a little about the title of your chapter number 3, which is Beyond Working Hour Restrictions. So the central message from this paper seems to be a little, workload does not, it's not the same as duty hours. So I'm a little puzzled, on the one hand, we want to have restrictions. On the other hand, we feel, does it make a difference or not for well-being? Could you explain a little?
Thank you for the question. Yes, the meaning of the title, in the meaning of the title, I like to have, or like to say that, yes, if we have a worker restrictions, yes, maybe work-life balance of the residents might be better in terms of quantitative workload. But when we think of qualitative workload, that might be different. For example, if residents are working just only for 6 or 8 hours, but the working environment was really bad, yes, that may be, that the workload is very big. Whereas if residents are working very long hours, let's say 12 hours or 14 hours, but if they have the sense of contribution, can have the community with their colleagues, or having the thank you by patients, maybe they will not feeling hard. That I don't think they have difficulty. Yes.
Okay, well, thank you very much for giving this explanation. I give the word back to the pro-rector.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Tolmans. The next opponent is Professor Valerie Was. She is Emeritus Professor of Medical Education at Keele University in the United Kingdom and currently affiliated with the University of Aberdeen, also in the United Kingdom. Professor Was.
Thank you, Pro-Rector. And thank you, Mr. Nishigori, for a wonderful presentation and for the privilege of reading your thesis. I so enjoyed it and opening up a lot of thought for me about different cultures for professionalism, which I've always felt quite passionately about. So I was grateful when Professor Dornan asked me to examine it. And like Professor Dolmans, I loved the photo, and I'm so grateful you explained it in the terms of dough. I often look at it and treasure it. So thank you very much for that. I'd like, if I may, to look at chapter 4. I loved your proposition number 5, doctors' intrinsic motivation is a two-edged sword. It both makes doctors put themselves out for patients and it burns them out. And in fact, Mr. Nishigori, I reflected on your thesis recently when I'm a retired doctor. And in COVID, we have a group of us working together to look at how difficult retirement is. And in fact, it's difficult for a lot of us because we're so motivated to help and to be out there helping in COVID, but we've given up our licenses to practice. Mm-hmm. And what is really difficult for a lot of us on retirement is to find the other parts of us, the parts of us that nurture well-being or the other things we can do in retirement. It's interesting how difficult it is. So I know what you've already mentioned, the generational differences, but why do you think it is that as our generation, we have got this difficulty of handing over and not wanting to help patients and to look at other ways of our well-being? Why do you think it is?
Sorry, dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you for asking that question. So you're asking about the generation gap of work ethics?
Yeah.
Yes. This is my personal opinion, so not evidence-based argument, but let's say in 15 years ago, the infrastructure of healthcare as well as education is not matured. For example, in Japan, we don't have many high buildings and lots of rice field. So we have lots of things to do for people. So I think that it was easier for if this is a correct word or not, but for older generation to do something good for others. Whereas recently we have much, well-established infrastructure, and it's becoming more and more difficult for younger generation to do something for others, like helping others. So that's one thing. The second thing is about the influence of the victory of capitalism in 1986 by the fall down of Berlin Wall. I think that at that time, the concept of communism lost, and the concept of capitalism won, and most of the people tend to think more that the earning more money or having more profit is good. So that make the next generations or newer generations work ethics change. Yes, that's what I have been thinking of.
I think that's really interesting, Miss Igori. About 5 years ago, as the College of Physicians in the UK, we looked at professionalism for the 21st century.
Yes, yes.
And we had a long debate about altruism, which you bring up in your thesis, whether it should be in our definition of professionalism or whether we should chuck it out.
Oh, really?
And the really interesting thing was we had a junior doctor on the panel, and he surveyed all the junior doctors in his, around him. And they were the people, we were 50-50 on the panel, but the junior doctors voted to put altruism in.
I see. I see.
In. So they still feel altruistic. And when you ask people why they become doctors, it's because they want to help people is often the answer. So can I bring you now to the other end of the spectrum, to medical education in the undergraduates? And clearly you do a lot of work with your undergraduates. What do you think we do to them that changes them when they come to us? And how would you change how you teach your undergraduates in Japan? You've been talking about a bit in terms of yarugai. Do you think we do something wrong? And how would you put it right?
Thank you for the questions. Again, this is my personal opinion, so not evidence-based. But again, I'd like to come back to my argument. I think that it's getting more and more difficult, or it's becoming more and more difficult to teach altruism, and let's say in a setting of big, huge hospitals with lots of healthcare workers. So one of the ideas of mine is to send students to, let's say, one of the developing countries where healthcare resources is not enough. And I have not been to developing countries many times, but I guess that there are lots more opportunities to see people or patients who seek help. That's what exactly happened in the time of 2011 when we had an earthquake and tsunami, and lots of older generation doctors went to Tohoku areas to help patients or victims because they believe that there must be patients or people who seek help naturally, and it's easier for them to feel yarugai by helping others. So coming back to your question, I propose to send students to, let's say, developing countries or rural areas or somewhere where the healthcare resources is not enough. That's my answer.
Thank you for your answer. And I like it, and it really links with you cannot know what they learn before they learn, your statement there, which was very nice. I'm not sure I agree with you. I think that even now, even with COVID, healthcare inequities and poverty are increasing in all our societies, certainly in the UK, certainly in the USA. And I've been to Japan recently, and high-rise buildings and everything are fine, but they do increase mental health. And I know sometimes in different cultures, mental health is more difficult to address. So I think I would challenge you on that and say, are you quite sure that within your own society, they can't learn more about the social determinants of health and how we need to be addressing this increasing global inequity? Do you need to go to a developing country, or do we not have enough problems in our own developing countries?
Would you please give a short answer, because
I was just
we have to move on to, you can give a short answer, please.
Yes.
Thank you.
But thank you very much. I love that question. To answer shortly, the answer is yes and no. I mean that yes, we yeah, it's good to send students to developing countries, but also there must be areas inside Japan where patients who have, let's say, poor patients who cannot access to healthcare system appropriately. So yes, we also have to find the places where students, where to send students inside Japan as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I give the word back to you, Pro-Rector.
Thank you very much, Professor Was. The next opponent is Dr. Helen Reid. She is clinical lecturer at Queen's University Belfast in the United Kingdom. Dr. Reid.
Thank you, Mr. Pro-Rector. And thank you, Mr. Candidate, for the opportunity to read such a fascinating piece of work. And I particularly enjoyed your consideration and application of the concepts from Japanese culture. I mean, you must forgive my pronunciation, but Bushido and Yaragai and Ikigai were fascinating concepts for me, which I just loved reading about your use of them. So thank you. And to start questioning, I would actually bring you to your title of your whole thesis. And as your subtitle, you talk about medical professionalism in the era of neoliberalism. And it is your application of neoliberalism that I would like to explore with you. And you invoke Japanese culture, work hours, catastrophe, and neoliberalism as overarching influences across your whole thesis. Yet I see more of the culture, work hours, and catastrophe. So I would like you to talk to us about why neoliberalism. How do you see that fitting in with all your work overarching your studies? Why neoliberalism?
Dear esteemed opponent, thank you very much for asking such a wonderful question. Yeah, my answer is linked to the answer I already have answered about the fall of Berlin's walls or the winning of capitalism or something. But again, this is my personal perspective. But recently, not only medical people, but people in general tend to think or behave more in a capitalistic way. For example, asking the question I described in my thesis, is it worth doing or is it worth learning? And the book I quoted, which is written by Dr. Uchida, that's one of the references I frequently use to discuss this theme in the influence of neoliberalism in education. And he described that, yes, and I think I myself do the same thing. I'm asking, is it worth learning before I learn? And, you know, for example, in the medical education, one of the typical example is the Kirkpatrick model of program evaluation. And also when I, or my colleagues as well, propose a fund, yes, we are usually or always asked to write the exit. So what's the outcome? Yes, after doing this research or after doing this program, after joining this kind of opportunity, what do we gain? What will we gain? Yes. But again, quoting the Dr. Uchida's words, yes, it is the capitalist way of thinking in education. And I think when I read his book, I thought that this is one of the one of the essentialistic problem rooted in our society, especially in terms of education. Yes. Mm-hmm. So, for example, in the educational committee in my medical school, we usually discuss how we use the students' words or students' saying on opinions. Someone say that when we don't have to follow the students' opinions too much, but others not. And I ask the question why. Yes, these two different type of thinking exist, and I found that an essential difference is that the way of thinking between capitalism and socialism. Yes.
Do you think? Sorry to interrupt. Have you more to say on that, or may I ask you?
Yes, please.
A particular aspect, I think, do you think in your Japanese culture are the particular tensions between the consumerist, commodities-based neoliberalism and your values-based cultures embodied in Bushido? Is that a particular reason you experience these tensions, say, in your own medical school, in your own setting?
Yes, I not only in my medical school institution, but Bushido is, yes, as I described, is originated in 1900. I mean, the 19th century thing. Yes, and the Bushi or samurai lives in let's say 18th, 17th, and 16th century, and they do not seek profits, but they are ruling a people. Yes. Whereas recently, especially after 21st century, yes, because of the expansion of neoliberalistic values, I personally feel that many people, especially the people in philosophy, are seeking other alternative values, yes, than neoliberalism. Yeah, so that's why I also like to seek one of them, and I thought that Bushido can be one, and that's why I quoted Bushido to use for my thesis. And also, one of the good things for me is that the Bushido itself was written in English, so it's easier for me, yes, to introduce, yes, in the field of medical education.
Many thanks, Mr. Candidate, and I pass the word back to you, Mr. Pro-Rector.
Thank you very much, Dr. Reed. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Janneke Frambach. She is Assistant Professor at the Department of Educational Development and Research and affiliated with the School of Health Professions Education. Dr. Frambach.
Thank you, Pro-Rector. I join the other opponents in congratulating you, Mr. Nishigori, with this wonderful piece of work. I was already familiar with some of your work, the Bushido paper, for example, before I received the invitation to be part of this assessment committee. So I was very happy to read your other work in the thesis in more detail as well. You add a Japanese perspective to a Western-dominated body of knowledge, and your work has had a lot of impact in Japan and beyond. So I think that is really a strength of the work. And I also was impressed with the methodology, the narrative approach that you took in some of your studies. So congratulations also to your supervisors. And of course, I have some questions that I would like to discuss with you about the Bushido paper to start. In the discussion chapter, you briefly mentioned some responses to this paper, and you also presented them in your presentation today. And I was wondering to what extent those responses, how you feel about them, and if they changed your views, and how do you feel currently about the Bushido paper, considering the responses that you received on this paper?
Dear esteemed opponent, thank you very much for asking the question. What you mentioned about responses is the responses I got in the Journal of Medical Education in Japan. Is it correct? So, yes, first, in Japan, before I published this paper, that the discussion on medical professionalism in Japanese medical education community is something like more controlling. So how can I say? It's something like there is one definition and the students and residents and other people have to follow it or something like that. Whereas when I published this paper, what happened is that the Dr. Nomura, yes, who wrote an counter argument in the Journal of Medical Education in Japan, conducted a kind of a symposium within their colleagues only, and without me. So one of my junior colleagues got very angry about that. So and she argued that there has to be some fair discussion space to talk with each other. And response to my junior colleagues' anger, not anger, but counter arguments, I proposed to the editor-in-chief in the Journal of Medical Education, saying that can you please set a kind of special issue in medical professions, and can you please have my article in Japanese, which is a kind of a translated article, as well as Dr. Nomura's article together in the same issue, and to ask readers to respond. Yes. And so firstly, to answer your question, I was really happy to have this kind of counter arguments. Secondly, as I talked in my presentation, yeah, the point is that whether I follow the utilitarian approach or not. And to be honest, I don't have an answer yet. Yes, sometimes I think that the utilitarian approach is more practical, whereas in other times not. Sometimes I like to pursue more, how can I say, concrete, more solid way to be a doctor. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, it
Could I ask a follow-up question then? Because yes, I was happy to see in your presentation that you indeed actually explained a little bit more about your thoughts of those responses, where you said, I'm more about the honor concept in the samurai way than the profit concept in the merchant's way.
Yes.
And but both of those then may exist when it comes to medical professionalism. And I was just wondering, I hear your personal viewpoints, and I've also heard your personal viewpoints in the answers to some of the other questions today. And that also brings me to another topic of reflexivity and how your own viewpoints shaped your work in this thesis. And now you've got some responses and other people bring in the utilitarian perspective, for example. Is that something that you would use in future studies? And how would you design a study in the future that may combine different perspectives and then challenging you to integrate that somehow with your personal standpoint, which is quite strong on this topic?
Wow, that's a very difficult question. Thank you very much. Yeah, I don't know. Yes, I may be I may follow more utilitarian approach in the future when doing the next study or not. But it's not a Bushido or Shonindo stuff. But I personally like to do more research on the concept of dose, because there are many dose in Japan, as I described. And some doses are more utilitarian and others more stoic, maybe. For example, the tea ceremony, which I now practicing, the sado we call it, is, I think it's very much stoic, which I love. So yeah, there are, within Japan, there are also diverse way of those, diverse way of thinking. Yeah. Sorry if I understand your question correctly, or I'm not sure, but that's my answer.
No, for sure. And I'm looking forward to your future studies. Thank you. I give the word back to the pro-rector.
Thank you very much, Dr. Frambach. The next opponent is Professor Teunissen. He is Professor of Workplace Learning in Healthcare at Maastricht University, and he is also Director of the School of Health Professions Education. Professor Teunissen.
Thank you, Pro-Rector. Dear candidate, I also want to start with compliments. I really enjoyed reading your beautiful thesis. I learned a lot from it. It was really a look into a different world. And you taught me about new concepts that I didn't know about. And there's no greater joy than learning something new when reading somebody's academic work. And so I think it is groundbreaking, especially the way in which you applied concepts like Bushido as a framework to these types of professionalism questions. And that also brings me to some of the things that I would like to discuss with you. How can one actually study different cultural influences? But before going into that in more detail, I'd like to ask you a short question, and that is that you criticize the neoliberalist, consumerist approach. You mentioned it before. Students might ask themselves the question, is this worth learning? What question would you like students to ask instead of this one?
Dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for the wonderful question. Probably I don't want them to ask the question, but just follow my request fast, then criticize me. That's one answer.
Yes, and I'm going to thank you immediately for that answer, because I am also aware of the limited time that I have. And I want to thank you because I think this answer also reflects, though, a certain path, a certain way of following. Now, I wonder if you look at Bushido and you try to understand how that is reflected in current medical practice, but you study that in the era of neoliberalism, then you might also be studying how people actually choose from those 7 principles within Bushido. So do you feel that you may have studied how within a current more neoliberalist society, Bushido is used differently instead of actually studying a difference between a neoliberalist and a Bushido approach?
Oh, thank you very much for the question. As I wrote in my paper, I also think that Bushido is, some parts are outdated. especially its inequality between men and women. So I don't think I'm going to apply the concept itself into the 21st century of medicine. So as I proposed in my paper or in the thesis, yes, Bushido is the basis of the value system in many Japanese, but we have to update it and we have to modify it in the 21st century of medicine, as well as the society itself. Did I answer? Yes, please.
In line with this, what direction do you think it needs to be modified in?
First, the Japanese samurai didn't talk a lot. Yes, so they not verbalize what they are thinking of. Yeah, so it may be good in my viewpoint that we should have more communication with each other. That's one thing. Again, the inequality between men and women must be modified or corrected, I could say. Actually, in the book of Bushido written by Inazo Nitobe, there is no clear definition of gi or yu or rei or something, other virtues as well. But he's writing several narratives describing that. So it's not a definition, but the method maybe. But we or I, including me, may have to revise it by using the present day people's narratives or stories, yes, of Gi or Yu or some others, yes. And I strongly think that the quoting the Japanese doctors' behaviors in the time of 2011 earthquake and tsunami is one of them.
And can I use my remaining time to ask for one more reflection from you? And that is that I see one communality between the different Do concepts and also a more consumerist approach. And that is that they all seem quite individualistic. It is about an individual's yarigai, their individual sense of contribution. What I'm missing is a more collective perspective where not individual doctors look for a sense of contribution, but where they get a sense of value out of participating in a collective that cares for a patient. Do you think that that can be part of the current Do approaches or a more neoliberalist approach, or that that requires a different type of mindset?
Thank you for the question. Yes, what I described in the chapter 5 is that the relationship between patients and doctors. But the concept of yarigai is a bit more wider. Yes. So, for example, if somebody is working for the community, and if it really valued not by the people working together, but by the community, yes, he or she can gain yarigai. So I don't think the concept of yarigai is not is individualistic, but can be collectivistic. Yes, yeah, that's one answer. Those, well, the concept though is, this is again my personal perspective, is but it's more individualistic. It's kind of the way of living. Well, yes.
Mr. Nishigori, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed, as you can see. And the degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and the quality, in particular, of your defense today. And I request that you await our return and the result of our deliberations. May I invite the committee to go to the breakout room, and we will be supported to go there. Mr. Nishigori, the degree committee here present online has assessed the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. And in view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. And Professor Doornen is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. Professor Doornen, please go ahead.
Thank you, Pro-Rector. Mr. Nishigori, do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present online, I hereby confer upon you, Hiroshi Nishigori, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, you will soon receive the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the supervisor, affixed with the official seal of the university, shown now by the beadle. Dear Hiroshi, you are no longer Mr. Nishigori. You are Professor Dr. Nishigori. Your way of the warrior along that beautiful path through the forest has brought you to a junction. Makiko and Sho will, of course, continue to be your closest and most beloved companions as you lead medical education in Japan and further afield into a future that will be brightened by your personal warmth and excellent scholarship. Jamu and I have profited so much from supporting you along your path, but now we wave you off on your continuing journey with great pride. We both feel also a little sadness that our contribution to your way of the warrior is more or less over. But we've been enriched by our experiences. We haven't profited in the neoliberal sense. Being your companions has given us Yarigai. Above all, though, it has strengthened our Ikigai, the fulfillment we get from being doctors, not just doing medicine and education. Hiroshi, you're a gentle but fearless warrior who displays all the moral virtues of the samurai. You showed rectitude by behaving in accordance with the virtuous reasoning of the samurai, which led you to work for the collective good rather than primarily for personal gain. This doctoral work tested your courage, and time after time, you continued to do right when others might not. You patiently resisted the authoritarian professor who wanted 6 additional people who had not contributed to your work to be added as co-authors, and the standoff around that lasted a year. You showed courage also as you lived through the grief that resulted from the death of your revered father, Dr. Takashi Nishigori, and as you then returned to your studies after your period of mourning. You also showed courage by personally contributing to the disaster relief effort, which put you at personal risk. And then you used your experience of showing that courage and that of your fellow countrymen to shed light on doctors' intrinsic motivation, which you know so well. You were polite, Hiroshi, when Western reviewers poured scorn on narrative analysis, which you conducted according to Japanese traditions that go back millennia. You were also charmingly polite when, as a qualitative interviewer, you felt impelled first to tell your life story so that you deserved to hear the life story of the people whose narratives you wanted to analyze. That is real narrative research. You conducted your work with a relentless honesty about how you did your work, what you found, and the limitations on your conclusions, even when you knew that critical reviewers were going to look actively for reasons to reject your articles, which they did. But the way of the warrior prevailed. You exemplified the ultimate pursuit of goodness by not allowing Western editors' hegemonic behavior to divert you from the path of virtue, and it's the West that's lost out there. I have left to last the virtues of benevolence, love, sympathy and pity, and loyalty, placing the group's needs above your own. You repeatedly apologized to Jamiu and I for your poor time management. But we knew perfectly well the work was taking a long time because you were repeatedly putting other people's needs above your own need. Hiroshi, I'm sure that completing your thesis will give you Yarigai, but I hope for more than that. I hope your willingness to test out your personal capabilities as a doctor, to find personal meaning in difficult situations, and to fulfill the duty of the capable will give you the ikigai that you so richly deserve. So, Hiroshi, hearty congratulations from Jamiu and I know that we share the sentiments that I've expressed. And I'm sure also from the members of today's committee who listened spellbound to your presentation and your masterly defense. Hearty congratulations, Hiroshi.
Thank you very much for wonderful words. Oh, I can't help words, but really moved. But thank you very much for both of my supervisors' patience, because it took so long to complete my PhD projects. But yes, I promise that I'm going to contribute, yes, to the field of medical education as one of the scholars, yes. And I look forward to working more, yes, with all of you in this field. Thank you very much indeed.
Dear Dr. Hiroshi Nishigori, it is my great pleasure to be the second one who congratulates you with your doctorate. And I do that also on behalf of the Board of Deans of Maastricht University. And I think that if I've seen it well, this is your second PhD. So yes. I should say to you, Professor Dr. Hiroshi Nishigori. I do that this time. And referring back to what the committee has said about your thesis and your defense, according to all of us, it's an important and relevant thesis, and it's novel work. So it's based on good studies that are really comparing two different cultural worlds in terms of values and professionalism. And I think that has a high value. And we would have enjoyed to have more time to discuss with you the results of your studies and the results of your thesis. But I think in total, we have enjoyed reading your thesis and hearing your defense today. I would like to include in my congratulations also your two supervisors who have guided you during the last, I guess, 4 years, maybe longer. And I think they did a wonderful job, and they may really be proud on the results seen in your thesis and heard in your defense today. So congratulations, Dr. Bouzari and Professor Dorden. It is great work. I would like to include also in my congratulations, of course, your wife Makiko and your son Sho. And I congratulate them and also the other members of your family with the academic honor that you have got today. I wish you much happiness in your life and a successful professional career. Further, before I end this ceremony, I would like to thank all the members of the committee, in particular the 5 opponents who have posed really interesting questions and evoked a nice discussion about the differences and the values of the professionalism in Japan as compared to Western culture. So again, thank you very much for your input in the degree committee today, and also in the thesis assessment committee that you did on beforehand. Hereby, I close this academic ceremony.